Welcome back to the Money and Wealth Show. I'm Sterling Fox, delighted to have Warren Jestin, Chief Economist with Scotiabank, as our special guest this week. Warren, let's talk about Canadian banks. We have, and the government is certainly the first to run this one up the flagpole, we have one of the most solid banking systems on the planet. And Canadians are justifiably proud of that. But I think we also develop a sense of insularity because of it. Our banks are so strong, nothing can take us down. And I think that borders on smugness. And I think it's perhaps not a good quality or a good attitude. What do you think?
Well, first of all, the Aussies would argue that their banking system is the strongest in the world as well.
One would expect nothing less.
Yes. And the one thing to point out, and I think one of the things that has made the system so strong, is the small number of institutions. So we have regulators, for example, that know people in institutions, the banking sector, on a first name basis. They know exactly what's going on. In the U.S., you got 7,000 or 8,000 banks.
Sure.
Regulatory control is a lot tougher to do. Your point about getting too smug is an important one. You can't let down your guard in terms of activity for a moment in the type of volatile markets we're in. You saw what happened to Greece recently in terms of, the type of mismanagement that occurred on the fiscal side and what can happen. If we begin to follow policies that aren't as cautious, I would call them prudent, you could go down the path of weakening our system. I do think that the way the government is approaching this, the regulatory environment, the federal government, the provinces, and the banks themselves, are to ensure that the soundness that we have earned, this reputation of having the strongest system in the world, has to be protected. It is something that is a strategic advantage. The strategic advantage comes from the fact that banks enable growth. They provide credit to consumers and to businesses. If your banking system goes down, it disables growth. That's what happened in the US and the UK. So we don't want to get too smug about it. We don't want to change things that effectively reduce the fabric and the strength of our financial institutions, because if we do, the whole economy suffers.
You said 7,000 or 8,000 banks in the United States. Most of us look across the fence to our next door neighbors and say, what a Wild West show their system is. They are so overdue for some serious regulatory changes. The Obama administration seems quite determined to implement some. Is there hope for the American banking system, or is it simply out of control?
Oh, I think the U.S. banking system has to be looked at in an important way. There's some very bad banks there, and there's a lot of very, very good banks. Okay, and once you get a stronger economy, those good banks will tend to show their fundamentals through. You're going to see some consolidation south of the border, so that the stronger banks with the better balance sheets that have been more prudently managed, that have diversified risks, will tend to grow. And they will be able to buy the ones that were badly managed but have good client relationships at a price that they never dreamed they could do a few years ago. So the consolidation happens. But what does it mean by consolidation? You go down from 7,000 banks or 8,000 banks to 6,000 banks,
exactly.
5,000 banks. There's still a long way to go. Effectively, the U.S. system, I think, has to be structured in a way that ensures that individual institutions are very prudent about how they manage risk, and that they focus on client relationships. In Canada, the client relationship is how we drive our business. In the U.S., you got a client in the door, you sold them something, then you sold that to somebody else.
Right, yeah.
Why have a client relationships? You just simply did the deal and you went on to something else. And that's fundamentally what has to be fixed, I think, in the U.S. system.
I want to ask you briefly about stimulus spending on the part of governments at all levels. The federal government calls it Canada's Economic Action Plan, but it's taxpayer money infused into the economy, ostensibly for infrastructure and other necessary projects. How beneficial has that been, and when should they get the heck out of the game?
Well, a year ago, or a little over a year ago, if these massive fiscal stimulus packages had not been put in many countries, I think we would have gone into a depression. I think it would still be on now. So it had a very important use in terms of finding the bottom in the economy and getting us off bottom.
Even in Canada?
Even in Canada.
Okay.
Because in Canada, you may remember, in March and April of last year, confidence had been shattered. We were having weakness in a broad range of areas. Exports were down big time. And effectively, what the government did was provide a stabilizing influence. But your important point here, the fundamental point, is the governments have to pull back. Most budgets right now are talking about pulling back and balancing the books again over a number of years, starting next year. Okay, we still have an economy that may be somewhat uneven, but at the end of the day, I think the focus from here on in is restoring a sounder fiscal footing. It is a strategic advantage for this country. One of the strongest fiscal situations in the world. That is a strategic advantage for our country. It allows us to keep taxes low and become more competitive. Now, if you look at the outlook, we've got a slower growth environment. So bringing deficits down is tougher. We've got a population that is aging. When you're 60 years old, the government of Canada or the various governments pay twice as much for health care as when you were 20.
Sure.
When you're 70, it's twice as much as you're 60. So bringing those deficits down is going to be tough. That's why we've got to focus in on it more and more as we go over the next year and really become much more serious in the years 2011, 2012.
We are fresh out of time, unfortunately, because it's just a pleasure to sit down and talk with you. It's unfortunate only that we can't do it for another hour or more, but Warren, it's been great of you to come by during your West Coast visit, and hopefully next time around we'll have an opportunity to pursue this conversation even further. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Well, thanks for having me in.
It's been a real pleasure. Warren Jestin, Chief Economist with Scotiabank, our special guest this week on the Money and Wealth Show. And we'll be right back.